this evening's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and those emerging. And to acknowledge that this is the unceded land of the Wurundjeri, and that we acknowledge as design professionals the continuing stewardship that they as cultures have had for this land long before European settlement. This evening's conversation is really about the launch of the book Systems Upgrade by Leire, Villoria, Asensio. Asensio, right?
Yeah.
All right.
It's okay.
And David Ma. I'm Professor Donald Bates. I'm the Chair of Architectural Design at the University of Melbourne. And both David and Leire are senior lecturers within the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and the Melbourne School of Design. The proceedings will be that David and Leire will give a bit of a background about the book and particularly the content of the book, a short presentation through the images of the book itself, and then we'll engage in a little small conversation after that, trying to pull out some of the strands and some of the aspects of the book. I have to say that I think it's a really beautiful book, even though we're here in this incredible bookshop of Euro. So I'm not just trying to sell it, although by all means there's a 5% discount this evening if you'd like to buy a copy of the book. But it's beautifully produced by really one of the top architectural publication firms in the world, Actar out of Spain, and really high quality reproduction and really quite luscious sort of printing, I think. So it's really a beautiful object, but I think really what we want to talk about today is the content and the issue that is raised with the book itself in terms of how design is a way of knowledge, but also how the knowledge of design leads us into some interesting conversations about how we develop architectural and material languages. So I'll turn it over to Leire and David.
Thank you very much, John, for the introduction. Thank you to everyone for coming today. After these last 2 years of COVID, it's great to be in a gathering like today. And thank you very much to Euro as well for hosting the launch. So without any further ado, I'll just start with a brief introduction onto the book. So the book really was motivated by a series of design, representation, and fabrication courses that we were invited to teach at Harvard University at the Graduate School of Design. And the way that we approached these courses was really motivated by the curious nature of discussions surrounding digital representation and fabrication at the time. We found the discussions strangely ahistorical, whereby references for guiding and legitimizing this area of creative exploration came from external sources, whether it be philosophy, biology, or mathematics. So when developing these courses, we sought to focus primarily on design history as a source of inspiration. The courses will focus on the material and materialization of design as the area of exploration. And again, rather than gaining legitimacy from external sources, we were invested in a design research which will focus completely on the study of design material from history through the lens of contemporary representation, design, and manufacturing tools. So the material artifacts and systems from history that were the primary focus of the study in these courses were largely from mid-century modern period, where there was a heavy investment in the exploration of design systems. So this was an interesting moment when a critical mass of designers were looking at developing tectonic systems intended for mass production. So the course began with a period of analysis and study of these precedents, reverse engineering process which redescribed the artifacts through the medium of associative models. And this analytical phase will be easily linked to a transformative or redesigning of these systems through the digital medium of the model that was generated. So in the course, we found that this process of redescribing and reinterpreting these precedents allowed for an extension of this earlier knowledge into applications or generation of new tectonic systems, which leverage the capacities and accessibility of digital design and manufacturing in practice. In the course, the projects range from a reinterpretation and redesign of envelope systems, structural systems such as the Huesos long span beam structures by Miguel Fisac, and the translation of earlier structural systems such as Nervis into new materials and also easier models of assembly. Some of the images that you are seeing are actually just few examples of the work that was produced in these courses. So other explorations included the transformation of tectonic systems by exploiting the capacities to link the protocols of manufacturing systems available today to these the design systems that they were actually generating, or a re-engagement with traditional the first 4 years here in Melbourne. So, in other words, the big body of research on Erwin Hauer that you see in the book has been done during our years here in Melbourne. And I'll pass it to David.
Yeah, so in principle, we were also very lucky, well, in particular the courses that Leire led, to be able to also engage directly with Erwin Hauer and his associate Enrique Rosado. And we also got to visit the studio in Connecticut, and they very happily came to give a lecture at the university. But we were exposed to the whole paraphernalia of objects that were actually part of the materialization process, which is very kind of compelling. You could see in their studio, it was first of all almost like a museum of their works, but it's also there's this whole collection of jigs and molds and all of these things that were there to kind of show you how they materialized the work this way. Yeah. So it just became really what we wanted to do as a model of doing historical research was to actually dedicate our research purely on a study of the material itself, the thing or the object, rather than either putting it within a stylistic period, talking about it within a stylistic period, or trying to kind of talk about it in relationship to a kind of author's biography. We just wanted to kind of take the objects in and of themselves. So one of the things we did as part of the process was really reverse engineering and studying how would you actually go about describing these forms through the associative models that we were using as a medium. So this forced us, there's no recorded, like explicitly recorded information on how they arrived at these forms. So we actually had to look at them and try and decode how that would happen. So one of the key moments that we found was this idea of the suture curve, but using this interesting associative model that was the intersection of the Oedipus surface and the sphere as the initiating point, and that becomes, let's say, the point from which a number of the design forms could actually emanate from. So there's these, that kind of breaks down the description of the form through this kind of longer process of kind of geometric description. And what's interesting about it for us is that it's not necessarily, you could get a better reading of the material form by doing 3D scanning, let's say, but by doing it like this, we are also tapping into ways in which, we interpret how you could actually describe these forms, right? So
and make them.
And make them. So these are just some examples of design one. How, in the book we kind of show you the full process of actually, in our case, interpreting how you would actually go about describing these forms.
Again, just bear in mind that Erwin Hauer is an artist, so there is not really paper trail of how he arrived to these designs. I mean, they're amazing objects. But...
So this extends to a series of other from designs from that series. This is design 3, I believe. So, yeah. And you can see here, this is just a collection from the book that shows like a range from the continuous series that we've done. So what we also did in that case is, we did this very deep material study, almost like a digital archaeology of the design precedents, and we used the associative model as the medium to bridge between that kind of more traditional research, if you like, and that could be the medium for us to think about how you would extend that knowledge into contemporary or future practice. So the associative model, because it's constructed as a series of geometric relationships, has the capacity to produce many other possible variations based on this initial code, if you like. It's almost like a geometric code of putting these things together, these objects, artifacts together, if you like. Yeah, I think it's looping back. So we can see here, these are just some drawings in the book that try and show that variability within the models that we produced. That ends up, in this case, you can see here, this is one particular design. This is the intercircles. And just a small sample of the different kinds of variations that come out that could actually be produced through the model, the variations on the model. And this here is also a video that shows a collection of other possible variations, which are either close to the originals or they start to depart quite significantly, but even the ones that are close to them start to do things which are quite different to the original. The originals were always very symmetrical and kind of isotropic. You can start producing things like asymmetry and variations on the faces, and all of these sorts of things come about by working with the models. So this is a sample of these here. Yep, I think it's repeating now. So just to give you a view of these, so then we also in the book try and show and decode how these new variations that work from the initial associative model can be described, and you get the quality, you get a sense of the quality of these collections. And this is just a small sampling of those here, and you can also, you saw that there's a full larger process of description. We can actually go back and truncate different parts of that process and just choose to kind of look at a certain part of the process and actually generate many more families just from that. So there's a lot of capacity in that link between description and the generation of other possible models here. And then we can then subsequently recontextualize them, looking at how they might perform. There's now capacities for us to think about how these things might operate beyond being simple screens. We could actually test them thermodynamically or in terms of light, and all of these sorts of other performances, which were not necessarily directly considered in the originals. And the other thing that was I'll just end here, that was interesting about that use of the associative model as the almost conceptual mechanism to think about these older histories and how it might relate to contemporary practice, is the idea of, a lot of these prototypes were actually done within the modern paradigm. So the industrial production, which was about, optimizing things for mass production, was I guess the culture of the time. And in many ways, within this logic of the associative model, that calls in a lot of other possible ways to rethink that, our relationship to tectonic systems. One of them is questioning the idea of authorship. So, if this is an associative model, rather than a kind of patent, a lot of these inventions were safeguarded through patents. Perhaps another model could be open source, which would mean you could open it up to many possible authors working on these, these codes and doing different variations. Also, in terms of the production, rather than a centralized, mass-produced, large inventory model, we could be talking about fourth industrial revolution ideas where smaller ecosystems of manufacturers and, which are distributed locally, could actually, account for a new model of production and dissemination as well. So I think that's a kind of very short summary of the book, but I hope that was okay.
Perhaps not explicitly, but has run through the structure of the book as well,
Yeah.
the different sections that the book has. Kind of first section that covers, and we'll be able to see it in the book anyway, but covers basically the background on where we stand, and then we go painstakingly through section 2 and 3, going through the whole process of redescription, redesigning, recontextualization, and refabrication of these systems. So yeah, I will leave it there. Maybe we open it for questions.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Leire. Look, I think there's a lot to say about the book in various aspects. I mean, again, as part of the introduction, I talked about the quality of the book, and I think that really is important. I mean, now that so much of our contact with knowledge transfer happens digitally, and so we're looking at screens and we're looking at stuff, and it's a heavy book, you know, you don't necessarily want to buy a lot of them and carry them around maybe, but at the same time, I think the quality is important in terms of setting it apart. The other thing that I guess I wanted to bring up is the degree to which a book like this is both to a certain degree, a polemic in terms of particularly around issues around design research and research as design and design making and so forth. But also the degree to which a book like this has a kind of, you might say, pedagogical role. That is to say, it's a book that students can look at, that students can see how different testing and experimentation can take place, that architectural production is not simply invention or pure imagination or pure individual talent, but there are processes. There are ways of taking an issue and developing it over time and through multiple iterations. So the kind of iterative aspect, and I think, you know, I'm looking at the pages go through, and there are clearly these iterative conditions of taking something, testing it, changing some parameters, testing it again, looking at more difference between one material and a different material and what that might be. So I guess I want to sort of hone in on the introduction, which is an important introduction by Hanif Kara, the engineer who I know has been associated with you guys both at Harvard and back in the UK. And his introduction talks a lot about this issue of design research. You know, can aspects of architectural production also be considered research? Or is it just producing things because they're going to go out into the world? So maybe you might say a little bit about where you situate yourselves in terms of this issue of design research.
Well, no, I think that's a very interesting question, and I always start by saying things like, I feel everything we do is research. Mm-hmm. I come from a very strong design background where even to come out with a certain design schemes, or there was a lot of research involved, and by that I don't mean just finding a couple of precedents and look at them and more or less pick and choose what you want, but rather really that aspect of interpretation of what you find and drawing it in this interpretative mode became key in our work. I will say, whatever we do, whether we are doing a heavy research like what you see in the book, or whether we are building a house, there is a lot of putting things apart, making, getting to the kind of essence of what is the material that we are working at the time, and the iterative nature that you are mentioning, etc., is something that is very much ingrained in the way we work. But if we look at this work, something that we mentioned a few times in the presentation was this issue of interpretation, and in the students' work that you saw, and that was really key, because it was not just redrawing something that you find, and in the case of Howard it's even more extreme because there are no drawings associated with the work. There were sculptures as a starting point, but in us drawing it and already thinking of it through the lens of contemporary modes of production, contemporary concerns, there was a certain way of drawing that found object that had already a lot of loaded material in this way. So for example, if I take it to the case of the courses that we led, or we deliver at Harvard, in that first phase of interpretation, there was also the making of the object, but not as found, already through the lens of, if I'm going to be using this material, what does it imply in the way that I should draw this? And certain associations, even if very proto-associations, were already made. And then in the iteration process that you were mentioning, Don, there was the slowly loading that associative model with more robustness, information, etc., about from structural concerns, material concerns, performative concerns of other kinds, to even, let's say, how it will affect that particular structural system or that particular construction system, how it will affect the found architectural type that it departed from. So, for example, with Fisac, something that was very recurrent was the fact that all the long span linear beams were always leading to these very blank buildings, like sheds, effectively, that had just, they had this beautiful, but just very scenical light. And one of the things that we came about by interpreting the beams, inserting other capacities within them because of the manufacturing capacities that we have now, was that you could start moving from a single direction to multiple direction, to be able to also start getting to have other three-dimensional and multi-performative aspects of the beam, so that they could potentially do many more things and create many more architectural types than the found one. And I know that this is not the venue to show those projects specifically, but it was very interesting how, by being very rigorous at the start with the interpretation of the found objects, you could get really far in the results that came later through the redesigning, as we call it, that phase, the refabrication, looking at it through the lens of refabrication, and what we call the recontextualization. Or with Fuller, for example, asking questions as to how will the spheres sit on a slope, for example, trigger a lot of set of questions about how to manipulate some of the geodesic spheres that we were looking at. So there were,
But just, I mean, one of the things you talked about is that from your point of view, it's very difficult not to think of every project as a kind of research project. Whereas if you compare it to most, at least in my experience, most architectural education projects, design projects, studio projects, they tend to be based on typologies. This is a house, or this is a commercial building, or this is a cultural building, and they tend to be on a beginning and an end with a kind of resolution. And yet, it seems to me that often in the guise or under the umbrella of research, it's not about resolution so much as advancement of understandings and opportunities and possibilities. And so, even, like in a school at the University of Melbourne, we and every other school of architecture in Australia and pretty much around the world have to deal with things like accreditation, where the assumption is that you're learning a certain domain of skill sets that qualify you as an architect. And research is not listed as any of those. And so I'm interested in the work that you show, particularly of the students primarily in Harvard, the degree to which those projects were considered design projects or research projects. And I don't want to make it binary, that it's either one or the other, but I'm curious as to how you would situate that.
Yeah, so I think one of the ways in which, so I'll do a very quick answer and then later address. One of the ways in which, well, first of all, I guess the front load, as Leire said, when you're doing the redescription, there's already, that's quite traditional research. It's a form of digital archaeology, which is kind of well accepted, and it's understood that that's a part of, it's contributing knowledge of what exists, right? I think the way in which the generative process can be, I guess, to some extent made generalizable and understood by everyone is that you make the process, that book is thick because we've actually made the process open, the whole part of it open to everyone. It's fully recorded. So in many ways, you can actually see how the process of generation has actually been done in a very kind of step-by-step manner. I think that laying that out bare, and actually forcing yourself to make always a kind of make very clear why each one of those steps are being taken in many ways makes that a form of, let's say, at least it communicates the process, and you're actually in many ways that's a form of research in the way that you've actually presented the process as part of the record of things. And I think, again, because you're also at the same time as you're making a record of every step, you're forcing yourself to always kind of qualify why that step is being taken. Whereas in many cases with design, the process, there's a black box. Somehow things go in, influences go in, and then there's never a requirement for you to make clear why you've arrived at a particular solution somehow, right? So, yeah.
So following that, I would say, yes, the outcome of those courses generally, I will say, because you always have better, colleagues than others or whatnot, but generally they were all contributing to research, basically. And for the reasons that David has just mentioned, I mean, that was kind of required in the course, but also in terms of advancement. I think it was very interesting and actually very fulfilling to teach such cohort of students and these particular courses. There was always such an amount of possibilities within the work that they were displayed, communicated, etc., and always choices made and with very clear, again, reasons, etc., to show all the way, perhaps, one possible evolution of that initial model into a possible outcome. But along the way, they were recorded, highlighted, communicated, a lot of other possible streams that were opened up by the work, which I think in terms of advancement, I think is key. In relation to what you were mentioning of accreditation, etc., I know we have to go through that. The problem is if we are stuck with best practices, we don't move forward.
Yeah.
So you need courses like these and I suppose people like us to keep at least trying to advance. And a lot of the faces that I recognize here, Peter, etc., like just...
Well, I think I think the other issues that we teach quite young students as well, and there's an expectation that they come in. Isn't it a kind of linear process? Like you kind of get from A to B pretty much in a straight line. And I think what we tell them is that it's not necessarily the case. We can't tell you how to get from A to B in a very definitive manner because you're always making decisions along the way. And somehow each one of those decisions could actually produce many possible iterations. So I think this idea of recording the whole process, and then at the same time, as you produce a kind of proposal, still recording what the other possibilities along the way that the decisions you take is, I guess, in some way, it's a form of design research in the sense that you are mapping the whole process in a very explicit manner. So.
I mean, I think the last point you make is interesting because one thing that I think comes in through the first sort of chapter, the first heading, is this idea of you're talking about and you're trying to explicate, you're trying to show some aspects of design history, which you also then say is also about the history of designing and what that might mean. And I think, most people, I think when they see the book, partly even just because of the cover, but then certainly as you flip through, as is happening on the screen, it looks like it's very much what we would sort of call digital design. It's around 3D modeling, it's around different, whether it's scripting or different parametric systems that allow variation and transformation. But in your first introduction or your first chapter, I guess, you reference a lot to Robin Evans and the question of drawing. And the question of drawing in architecture is always being a translatory condition or a documentation condition or a notational condition. So I think, we are, for most students nowadays, they've only grown up knowing kind of digital design. But you still situate some of this work in that interchange between drawing as a document, as a notation, as a process, and then there's also the product. And then you talk about the materiality. Maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Do you want me to go?
I don't mind.
I think there is, there is, Robin Evans is always a very strong reference to us, as you pointed out in the book. I think in the way that we go through the reinterpretation of these models, there is, first of all, there is a lot of research. If we take Hauer and we look at our interpretation of the continuous series, we went through a lot of, drawing, whether it's in the digital realm or not. In the end, it's a craft that you need to go through. It's not a found script that you just run and get something out of it and whatever. I mean, it was about through descriptive geometry, through many means, like really trying to understand, first of all, the continua series, the kind of endless line that
looping
appears, the
pattern, yeah.
looping part, that
The
is
sort
kind
of over, the sort of surface that becomes fore and background at the same time.
Exactly. So there was a lot of like different attempts, and they were always we found them very flat, which would have been one interpretation that we have seen many people doing, but somehow there was certain three-dimensional depth in the work, that physical depth, that we were unable to basically see where it was coming from. And there is very little bibliography on the work of Hauer, but somehow we came across this idea of the suture curve, like in baseball balls, that is the best way to stitch a sphere so that it doesn't sag, basically, it doesn't deform as much as if you do it through the equator, so to speak, or the great circle. And we were really keen on finding how that idea of the suture curve came out. And again, we tried lots of things. So all this is through drawing iterations in the Robin Evans way of really interpreting and understanding. And we came about, or we somehow investigated the mathematics too, that the intersection of an NPR surface with a sphere gives you this suture curve. That was a huge achievement, because then all of a sudden you start having a lot of possibilities to play with, and we don't know if Hauer arrived to it like that, based on what he described when we met him. He was doing it through wire bending and whatnot, because again, he has other tools than us architects. But for us, drawing is very important. I mean, it's kind of key, drawing, model making. We were trying all these things. And all of a sudden, when you discover is the NPR and the sphere, different ranges of the NPR, different diameters of the sphere gives you different depths of this suture curve, and a whole world opens to you in that sense of like, the advancement. It might not have been the point of departure of Hauer, but certainly became a window for us to get into the development of these, tectonic systems that had that variability of the depth, and let alone when we got into, okay, now we have the curve, how do we give it thickness?
Yeah.
That was another series of interpretations and through drawing discoveries of how to achieve that through the means that were, I guess, available to us, but also that, we also enjoy. And we're dealing with descriptive geometry, so this is something that, we really enjoy a lot. So we decided to go that route rather than, again, as David mentioned before, just get a 3D scanning and you get the object, but then how do you manipulate it? You get the cloud of points, but what do you do with it? It's not generative. It's just, sure, you get a replica, but that was not what we were after.
That taps in a little bit to, I think you isolated the fact that we had made some comment about this descriptive process is also not a history of design so much as it is a history of designing. So I think by somehow reverse engineering and finding the ways in which you could actually, geometry is really like the only way in which we as architects still, I think in many ways, communicate our ideas, and it's the thing that translates it into materialization, right? So I think in many ways, forcing ourselves to reverse engineer and actually do it simply from the composite of all these geometries is maybe tapping into the process of the design of the thing itself, but maybe it's more of a description of it, but somehow we're getting to, that description already becomes a kind of design record as well.
I want to jump now. We'll end here in just a moment or so everybody can have a drink and buy a book and so on and so forth. But you talk a lot in the book and in your presentation, not against, but you say, look, the work we're doing is not about authorship, like the individual author coming up with an idea or a design. It's not about typologies. It's not about program and such. It's a lot about objects and about materiality. But usually, at least my experience in architecture, when we talk about materiality in architecture, we often go to architects like Scarpa. We go to architects, like Williams and Zine, Billy Zine and Todd Williams. You think about Alto and his experiments around his house with different doorknobs and handles and so on and so forth. But in the research of this book, the materiality is either ceramics or maybe wood or a few things, but it's So I'm interested in understanding better when you use the word materiality or materialization, what that might mean as opposed to the kind of convention of just using really interesting materials on a project.
So I think that's a little bit of a hangover. There was a larger discussion about material organization when we were working back in London and studying back there, and that really took on the idea of, I think it was a counterpoint to the figures that you were talking about. So it wasn't Zumthor and Williams and Cien, but it was really accepting the fact that our relationship to materialization is really through geometry and drawing in many ways. I mean, that keys back into why we linked ourselves to Robin Evans, is that you got to get really good at that capacity, because that's really our conduit to materializing things. So in many ways, it also meant that we were very interested in the direct effects that the geometry produces. So I think we make a little bit of a discussion about how in Evans's text on the perturbed circles, he makes the distinction, like he's following another way of reading drawing, which is different from the typical academic way of either it's a symbolic use of geometry or it's about a style. It's really about the practice geometry. If you really look properly at the thing, like centralized churches, there's not a centralized church, there's many centralities if you look at the drawing properly, right, somehow. So that's also what we mean by, material, being very attentive to the geometries and forms that you're describing and the different effects in them in a very direct level, but mediated through drawing.
So in that, with material organization, just to get a little bit from that, it's included the materiality, obviously, in terms of physical, tangible material, and how, again, we arrived to that through geometry in the end. And both in our studies of Hauer, but especially in the courses, there was a constant translation from the geometric drawings, the digital drawings, to the physical materialization of those through the making. So there was, I think in the end the students were very in tune of what the value of the drawing was and how it was then translating, and vice versa, and the types of drawings that you needed to make, also to use different manufacturing tools and whatnot. But also in the material organization, I feel that by using this term, etc., you are able to receive many more types of information into it. So some of them could be performative. With Hauer, for example, the issue of light became very, very important. The modulation of light, the visual screening or not, the perception that you get, and finding the types of drawings that will allow us to evaluate that and to further kind of fine-tune. Or in this case, I wouldn't say it's just fine-tune, because we were not after the singular solution. It was always the range of options. So, what will be the range of opportunities that you have with this set of values? What will be whether it's spatial effects, performative effects, structural, lighting, in terms of the sort of plans that you will get as well, with this other range of values. So it was always about, open up.
Yeah.
As
opposed to trying
to
refine.
Exactly. One. And typically there was, because of an issue of time within the courses, there was perhaps one that then was taken further, but not without big load of showing all the possibilities, or a lot of the possibilities that were open through the research.
And one more thing also, just the link between geometry and drawing and materialization, the materialization process, even with, funny enough, with digital fabrication nowadays, that link is even stronger now. So rather than just focusing on defining or describing the object, how a machine cuts things, you got to define geometrically the tool path. You got to define geometrically how the robots move around and things like that. So that's actually
not even that. The customization of the tool bit when you are using the milling can give you a lot of other descriptions of the drawing through. So it's
Great. All right. Well, listen. I want to first of all thank you very much for both the book, which is now available, and for the presentation, which I think helps to elucidate some of the intent behind the work that obviously is a lot of work, putting a document like this together and everything. So maybe you could help me in thanking them for this presentation. And for those of you who happen to be in the room here, please look around the rest of the bookshop. There's some great things you may or may not want to take home with you, hopefully purchase. There's the books itself, but also we do have a bit of refreshments for everybody that's here. Thank you very much to Euro Bookshop for providing this venue and this opportunity to show this new document and to make it available to the public. So, and thank you for everybody who tuned in for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.